Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 24th lecture in our course on general psychology. And this lecture will begin a new unit. And this is actually one of my favorite units. It's the unit on social psychology. So we will talk in this lecture about survival. And I've put the parentheses there in the Darwinian sense because we're going to talk about survival both in a sort of short-term sense. We'll talk about aggression, we'll talk about cooperation. Uh, but the Darwinian sense part is there because we're going to talk about sexual selection. So Darwinian survival means passing your genes on to the next generation. So obviously that requires reproduction. So we're going to combine the topics of cooperation and aggression with that of sexual selection. So this is about surviving in a social world. So we'll be introducing the idea of social psychology, which, because of the word social, means it's going to involve other people. So we'll look at things like aggressive behavior. Uh, what is aggression? How and why do people exhibit aggressive behavior? We'll look at the flip side of that, cooperative behavior. And as your book points out, both of these behaviors are goal directed. You're trying to survive. They're just very different means of doing so. And then again, we will look at sexual selectivity and how people select a mate, how attraction works, that sort of thing. So in particular, we're going to see that, first of all, social contact is absolutely crucial, that there are a lot of negative outcomes to being deprived of social interaction as you develop and as you function as an adult, for that matter. We're going to learn about aggression, see that aggression is a psychological phenomenon, involves behavior, but there are some biological and environmental factors that are important as we try to understand aggressive behavior. We'll also see that cooperation isn't as necessarily qualitative as it sounds, that we can study cooperation in the laboratory and try to learn what causes cooperation, what causes it to break down. We'll also see that social interaction can have some downsides too. And this is going to be emphasized in the second part of this unit. We're going to see some of these negative consequences of living in a complex social world where we have a lot of people around us. We don't always know what they're thinking. We don't always know who they are. And so looking at how other people influence us and how we try to understand other people is going to be the main topic for lecture 2 in this unit. We're also going to look at sexual attraction, and we'll look at that at the end of today's lecture. And we'll look at relationships, how they develop, uh, what attraction is based on. We'll see there are some biological correlates to attraction. And we'll also look at relationships, in particular long-term relationships. We'll look at marriage, for example. So all that will be today. So first we have to define our terms, as always. So not surprisingly, social psychology is the study of how our psychological experience is influenced by others. Your book defines it as the study of the effects of sociality. Uh, I don't like that definition mainly because it uses the word social in the definition of social psychology. So you're using the definition to kind of reinforce itself, which I don't find very clear. So I'm using a different definition here. But that last word in this definition, others, other people, that is the basis of social psychology. So we're looking at feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, and we look at this a lot. So these are sort of the outcomes. How do other people make you feel? What do other people make you think? How do other people make you behave? And we should note here that others uh, doesn't have to be accurately perceived by the person. What do I mean by that? Well, there could be somebody right in front of you, so there's an other. But the presence of other people could be implied, it could be imagined, and that is part of social psychology also. In fact, many experiments imply the presence of other people, but you don't actually see them. And yet people will behave differently just when they think other people are around. They don't necessarily need proof. And so that's what I mean here, is you don't have to accurately perceive other people. So in general, social interaction, social contact is very important. Uh, Isolation can have very detrimental effects, especially if it's long-term isolation. So people, for example, that are in solitary confinement uh, eventually develop symptoms of mental illness in many cases, symptoms of psychosis, that is, symptoms that are similar to those of schizophrenia, hallucinations and delusions. Health outcomes become worse uh, in socially isolated individuals. The risk of depression goes up. And so this is one reason that many people oppose uh, solitary confinement as a means of punishment in our prison systems. Actually a relatively new phenomenon. At first, it was present in the prison system, then it went away, and then it got brought back around the 1960s. But anyway, it can have a very detrimental effect on the health, especially the mental health of the individual. And there have also been cases, not in the prison system, where an individual was socially deprived during childhood, and these are very unfortunate cases. The picture here on the right is of an individual known as Jeannie, who, for approximately the first decade of her life, was socially isolated. She was locked in a room, tied to a chair. She was given food. She survived physically, but her parents were both mentally ill themselves and did not provide her with any social contact. And so her language skills did not really develop. But also, she had the appearance of a much younger child. This is what's called psychosocial dwarfism. So, again, her nutritional needs were taken care of to a certain degree, but she did not get any social interaction for the first years of her life. And so she appeared to be a child that was younger than she actually was by quite a few years. So she was smaller in stature. Her features were less developed. And so, again, effects of abuse and isolation can result in altered physical development in addition to mental development. Why is social interaction important? Why do we have social function as such a cornerstone of our lives? Well, first, survival. Uh, People physically don't have a lot of natural defenses. We don't have hard scales, we don't have claws, we don't have particularly fearsome teeth. Uh, we do have a lot of intelligence. And so other people can be crucial in order for us to survive, especially in our evolutionary history. We think that a lot of our survival depended on cooperative hunting and gathering, for example. Of course, you need other people in order to pass your genes on, in order to reproduce. And that's where we get to that social survival in a Darwinian sense. Getting other people to work with you, maybe in a way that's directly necessary for your survival, but it could also be the case that having other people around just makes your life easier. You have to expend less effort as an individual than you do as part of a group. And so, again, energy in our evolutionary history uh, has been a precious commodity. You don't want to expend more energy than you have to. And so getting other people to help you in some way or to work with you can be necessary for survival. And then understanding other people is very important. Other people can help us survive, but they can also represent a great risk of harm, especially if we can't anticipate their actions. And so understanding other people, their motivations, their emotional expressions, trying to predict what it is they're going to do, those can be critical components of our survival as well. Okay, so to begin our lecture on social survival, we'll start with aggression. So first, what is aggression? Aggression is any behavior that's intended to harm someone else. So it doesn't necessarily have to be physical harm. It doesn't have to be physical violence, although certainly that qualifies. Physical violence is a form of aggression. But if you deprive someone of resources, if you take their money, for example, that is aggressive behavior, even though it's not physically violent. So there are a number of behaviors that qualify as aggressive. And the question is, why do people do it? So the short answer is that if you can get away with aggressive behavior, that often gives you some sort of advantage. So if you can take resources with no repercussions, then you have more resources. You're more likely to survive. But of course, there are downsides, especially if other people behave aggressively as a result. So what's the more proximal cause? Uh, well, one idea that's been put forth is what's called the frustration aggression hypothesis. And your book uses a good example that if, for example, someone needs money, they can't just take money from the bank. There's a vault, there are locks, there are guards. So that is frustrating. That gives them a bad feeling, what we call negative affect. So the fact that their goals have been thwarted leads to negative affect, and that negative affect increases the likelihood of aggression, in this case, robbery. So that's the idea of the frustration aggression hypothesis, is that first you have negative affect because your goals can't be accomplished. And then in response to that negative affect, you then behave aggressively. So the centerpiece there is some sort of difficulty in achieving your goals, and that difficulty then leads to negative affect, to feeling bad. There are other influences on aggression as well, so that's sort of a causal model that X leads to Y leads to aggression. But what other more subtle influences exist? Well, one is the sex of the person exhibiting the behavior. So the vast majority of violent or aggressive behaviors and crimes are done by men. So being male puts what an increased risk for being aggressive, behaving aggressively. Of course, one of the characteristics of being male is elevated levels of testosterone. And so the question is whether testosterone causes increased aggressive behavior. And the evidence is a little bit mixed. It's not as simple as testosterone equals more aggression. Uh, I'll go into why here in a second. This figure in the top right is from your book, and it's from a study in which people were asked to say when a series of faces became aggressive, when they became hostile. And if the person got a little spritz of testosterone right before, it took a more aggressive face for them to say, yes, that person is hostile. So testosterone can change perception of hostility in others. And of course, if you fail to recognize that someone else is angry, that can increase the likelihood that you're going to be in some sort of confrontation. This is not from your book, this is from a different source. But if you take rodents and you remove the testes, that is the male sex organs, which produce the most testosterone, not all of it, but most of it, then aggressive behavior almost goes away. Not entirely, but almost. If you then reintroduce testosterone by injection, then the aggressive behavior comes back. So there is a link between testosterone and aggression, but we have to be a little bit careful because, for example, puberty is a time for males when testosterone levels are high, and yet adolescent males do not exhibit that much more aggressive or violent behavior than 20-year-old males. And so it's not simply the case that more testosterone equals more aggression. There are some correlations, but there are other factors there as well. There's one question as to whether temperature influences aggression. So your book has this figure where pitchers in baseball will be more likely to hit another batter, a batter on the opposite team, when it's warmer. And so the idea there is that hotter temperatures cause more aggressive behavior. Now, first, there's sort of an upside down U-shaped curve there. Yes, it's true to a certain extent, but then once it gets hotter than around 80 degrees, people actually become less aggressive. Also, the source that your book cites uh, makes a point that it's not necessarily the average temperature. They make a point of saying that crime increases as you get closer to the equator, uh, But the fact is that as you get closer to the equator, it gets warmer, but it also gets more variable in terms of climate. And so those researchers are actually saying that's the variability in the climate, not necessarily the average temperature, that is causing an increase in aggression. So that's sort of an open question still. Culture certainly plays a big part. So certainly here in the U.S., we have differences between northern and southern cultures. And your book describes a famous experiment in which individuals were insulted as part of the experiment, and then as they left the experiment, a large individual was walking down the same hallway toward them, and then the experimenters measured whether the participant was aggressive toward the large individual. And if they had just been insulted, the Southerners were more aggressive. They got in the face of the large individual. However, if they had not been insulted, then they were actually less likely than the Northerners to become hostile. And so the idea here is that Southerners are more entrenched in a kind of a culture of honor, a culture where threats to status are dealt with aggressively, that it's acceptable to exhibit aggression if your status has been threatened. Whereas in the North, that is not the norm. And so culture has a part to play there as well. Okay, so that's aggression. And now we'll look at its opposite, cooperation, which is when you have two or more people and they engage in some behavior where everyone benefits. It's not one person being helped and another person being harmed. That's more typical for aggression. But cooperation is where everyone benefits. What's interesting is that in recent years, psychologists have been turning increasingly toward economic tasks, in particular a discipline called behavioral economics, to look at multi-person cooperative behavior. One of the most famous tasks here is what is known as the prisoner's dilemma. And so the story for this task is that you and an accomplice have been caught in some crime. The police bring you to the station, put you in separate rooms for interrogation, and tell each of you that if you confess and your accomplice doesn't, they'll serve the prison time and you'll go free. If you both confess and rat on the other individual, then you both serve a couple of years. Not as bad as if you had said nothing and your friend ratted on you. But if you both keep quiet, if you cooperate, you both only serve 1 year. So what's interesting here is that technically you're better off if you confess and rat on your friend, no matter what your friend does. So if they stay quiet, if you confess, you get to go free, and they do a lot of jail time. If they confess and rat on you, you're still better off if you rat on them also. So economically, your biggest incentive is to confess, to rat on your friend. But many people, when faced with this task, will cooperate with the friend or the accomplice or the partner, whatever you want to call them. And that way, they both serve a little time. Relative to the largest penalty, you get a little reward for each of you. So that is cooperation. So it benefits both of you to cooperate. You have an incentive not to. And yet many people engage in cooperative behavior. A related game is what's called the ultimatum game. And here you have one individual with an amount of money, let's call it $10, and that person proposes a split. They could say, okay, well, I'll take half, $5, and you keep the other half. Or they could say, well, I'm in control here, or I was given the money first, I want most of it. And so they could say, I'll keep $6 and you can get 4, or I'll keep $7 and you can get 3, or I'll keep $9 and you can get 1. Now the other person has to make a decision. They can either accept the offer, in which case the split goes forward as proposed, or they can reject it, in which case both people get nothing. Now, again, an economically rational agent would take any offer that wasn't zero, because something is always better than nothing. So if you were a robot, then that $9 versus $1 offer, you would take that in a heartbeat. $1 is better than nothing, which is what you'll get if you reject the offer. And yet people routinely reject unfair offers of 80-20, but even 70-30. People will tend to accept the 60-40 offer. It's a little unfair, but not so unfair that they reject it. And so this task looks at cooperation and looks at how cooperative people are willing to be when someone is behaving unfairly. And so again, people will often forego a reward for themselves if they can effectively punish another person for making an unfair offer. And I just gave you a fairly small example in terms of money available, but economists have gone around the world and looked at this behavior even with large amounts of money, playing for what is effectively 1 month's salary, and people will still reject unfair offers. Here on the right, we have an image from a study that looked at the brain while people were engaged in this behavior. And when somebody makes an unfair offer, there's activity in an area called the insula, and also rejecting unfair offers is associated with activity in the prefrontal cortex. So clearly parts of the brain are sensitive to the fairness of the offer and can respond in order to reject that offer. A third economic task that's been used increasingly in recent years is the public goods task. This one's a little more complicated, but what it looks at is a group of people, and everyone is offered the chance to put some of their money, they start with, into a community pot. Now, whatever they put in is going to grow by some factor. It could be by 1.5 times. So there's more money now in the game available if people contribute. And then what happens is that money then multiplies. It's now in one big pot. You can't tell whose money is whose. And then it gets split evenly. So this is a very common social scenario where a public policy or some structure or some community entity needs funding or needs resources from everyone, but people aren't required to give the same amount. In fact, they can give nothing at all and still reap the benefits of the resource whenever it matures. And this is what's called the tragedy of the commons. So that there are many resources and entities that are enjoyed by the entire public, but are funded by groups of individuals. And so the best thing to do in this task, if you want to make the most money, is to hope that everyone else contributes a large amount and contribute nothing yourself. That way you get to keep your initial amount and you still get the split from that public good. And so this is what happens if you play this game. If there's no way of enforcing, of punishing people who don't contribute, then pretty quickly people realize they can just do what we call free ride. They can contribute nothing, still get part of that public good, and end up with a lot of money. And so people will eventually contribute less and less until pretty soon no one's contributing anything at all. However, if you allow people to punish each other, now you start to see more cooperative behavior. So now you have an incentive to contribute. You don't want to be punished. And what's also interesting is that people will pay money to punish others who don't contribute. So it actually costs these individuals to go forth with this punishment. It's costly to enforce this norm, to enforce the idea of cooperation, and people will do it. So as long as you can punish people, you get really high levels of contribution. So again, it's another way of looking at this facet of cooperation, looking at the degree to which people will free ride, will try to take advantage of a public entity, with or without the ability to punish each other. Okay, so that's cooperation in a nutshell. When people work together in groups, there are some other downsides as well. One is that people within a group can exhibit some form of prejudice. So what is prejudice? Well, prejudice is when you evaluate someone based only on their group membership. Uh, of course, we're all familiar with the concept of things like racial prejudice, where you make a judgment about someone, about their behavior, about their personality, uh, that's based just on the ethnic group to which they belong. It's not based on observations of that individual. It's not based on any kind of report or data that says how that person behaves. It's an assumption that, oh, well, this person belongs to this group. They must be this kind of person. They must behave in a certain way. And we're familiar with prejudice being a negative concept. There's also a positive form of prejudice, not in terms of its overall effects, but in terms of how people get treated. And this is what we call in-group favoritism. So when somebody is in a group, they are more likely to give resources or view favorably other people that are in their group. And these groups can be totally arbitrary. There have been experiments where people are placed on two teams at random, and people will still view members of their own team more favorably or will give them more resources, even though being part of that group is totally arbitrary. When groups get together to make decisions, there are also some possible negatives. One is that expertise and status get treated differently. So even if someone is an expert in the area in which the decision needs to be made, uh, their opinion often doesn't count as much as someone who is simply high status. So someone who has a lot of influence in other social domains, someone who's famous, or someone who's attractive. So these can all outweigh expertise, which in the context of a decision is a more legitimate reason to listen to someone. There's also what's called the common knowledge effect. And that is that when you have a group of people trying to make a decision, they will often make that decision based not on all the facts available, but based on what all of them know in common. So they'll focus on only those facts that everyone already knows. And again, this has an interplay with the expertise, because often experts will bring in new knowledge that no one else has. And that knowledge tends to get downplayed because not everyone shares it. And so people tend to focus again on those facts that they all know, whether those facts are particularly helpful or not. There's also the phenomenon of group polarization, where if you independently ask people's opinions about what you think the group should do, you'll get a set of moderate opinions. When you put people together, they'll often decide on an extreme course of action or settle on an extreme opinion. So the group becomes polarized. They reinforce one another, and the position of the group becomes more and more extreme. There's also the phenomenon of what we call groupthink, which is when minority opinions or contradicting evidence becomes suppressed or isn't brought up uh, in the interest of group harmony. So people want to be nice to each other, they don't want to engage in confrontation, and so they'll engage in groupthink. So they'll all agree, even though there might be data that point out that this decision is wrong, or there might be people who don't agree, but they keep quiet, again, in the interest of not upsetting other group members or confronting them. And this was an issue in the 60s during the Kennedy administration with, for example, the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. And so this is a case where uh, a team of decision makers, in this case the CIA, uh, put together this plan to try and invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. Uh, and it turns out that there was evidence that this was not going to work, that there were people in the room who thought this wouldn't work. But they didn't say anything. They didn't offer up those minority opinions for fear of upsetting the group and being isolated from the rest of the group by their opinion. Now, this Bay of Pigs invasion was a disaster. Uh, the Kennedy administration corrected this when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there, everyone was encouraged to speak up, even if they didn't agree, and that process went much better. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a positive resolution, whereas the Bay of Pigs invasion was a disaster. Another effect when groups to get together is the diffusion of responsibility. You'll get things like mob behavior, which we see here in this figure in the bottom right. And this becomes more severe the more people there are in the group. So the more people there are in the group, the less of an individual identity each person has. The less they listen to their conscience, the less they use their own particular moral values. And so responsibility gets diffused, gets spread out, and people behave less responsibly. This is linked to what is called social loafing, where when you put people in a group, they will put forth less effort than they would have as individuals. They'll sort of assume that everyone else is going to put forth an effort, and so they don't have to work as hard. If you've ever worked on a group project for school, you may have experienced this, where some individuals don't work as hard in the group because you're all in it together. They assume that you'll work hard in order to get a good grade, and so they don't have to work so hard. This is also evident in that task from the previous slide, the public goods task. So there, people will exhibit social loafing. They won't contribute, and yet they'll still reap the benefits of other people contributing. A related phenomenon is what's called the bystander effect. And this is where, in an emergency, the larger the group of people involved in the emergency, the less likely any individual is to help, to be active and do something. This was demonstrated in a really clever set of experiments, one in which somebody was in an experimental chamber, part of an experiment, and they heard what they thought was someone having a seizure. And they knew other people were around as well. And so the more people that were in the group in the experiment, they couldn't see them, but the more people they thought were there, the less likely that individual was to try and help the person having the seizure. Again, they couldn't see that person either. We get back to the perception of other individuals. But they assume other people would help, and so they don't have to help themselves. On a related note, another similar experiment with that same group, you're placed in a room with another person, and you start seeing smoke coming in through the door. If that other person doesn't do anything, then you're less likely to do anything yourself. If the other person isn't there, then you're far more likely to get help or raise the alarm or whatever. So again, the larger the group, the less likely we are to be active ourselves when there's an emergency or something that needs action. So that brings us to one final multi-individual behavior, and that is altruism. And altruism is a behavior that you intentionally commit that helps someone but costs you something. So it could cost you something monetarily, could cost you money, but it could just cost you time or effort or harm. And so you help someone, it benefits them, but it harms you in some way, costs you something. And some behaviors may seem altruistic at first, but if you look closely, there is some hidden benefit. It may be subtle, but it's often there. So for example, bees and wasps and termites, you'll have members of a hive that sacrifice their effort or time or even their lives for the sake of helping other members in their hive. So when bees sting you, they often die as a result of that sting. And so the question is, why would any bee sacrifice its own life for the sake of these other individuals? It seems altruistic, but in fact it isn't, because all the members of the hive are closely related to one another. They are often siblings. And so by helping the other members of the hive, that individual is helping its genes get passed on to the next generation. And so it doesn't help the individual, but it does help that individual's genes, and so those genes can get passed on to the next generation, cause those individuals to behave cooperatively or seemingly altruistically, and then those genes get passed on again. And so the point there is that by exhibiting what we call kin selection, by preferentially helping relatives, you are in a sense helping yourself because you're helping your genes get passed on. There's also what's called reciprocal altruism. And there, it's kind of a form of extended cooperation where you both benefit. Sure, you might help someone at a cost to yourself right now, but the idea is that the other person will then pay that favor back at a later time. So this occurs when two animals groom each other. So at first, one animal is giving up its time and effort to groom the other, but then they turn right around and switch roles. So that's not altruism either. In our society, you might pay for a meal with the expectation that the other person will pay for the meal next time. So sort of a tit for tat system. Now, that's not to say that there isn't altruism, genuinely. There are altruistic acts in individuals. So here in the lower left, we see Wesley Autry, who got famous for uh, helping someone that was having a seizure in a New York subway station. The person fell onto the tracks as a train was approaching, and Autry threw himself on top of the individual and kept them down while they were having a seizure, and the train passed over them both. So that was obviously a physical risk to Autry. He could have been harmed or killed in that incident, and yet he did it anyway. Now, sure, later Autry had a public speaking career, so you could say, well, he did benefit in the end. However, it is unlikely that Autry behaved the way he did with the anticipation of that benefit in the long term. So I think we can call this a genuinely altruistic act. There are cultural influences on altruism. So your book mentions a parking study where individuals were approached and asked if they would either give up their parking pass so that the person asking could use it for a week, or asked if they could clear out all the cars and use the parking lot for a tennis tournament. Now, people of European descent tend to come from more individualistic cultures, and they find the request to give up their personal parking pass more off-putting. They're more willing to let the parking lot as a whole be used for some public purpose, but they're reluctant to give up their own personal pass if no one else has to give up anything. Individuals from East Asia or Latin cultures come from a more collectivist ideology, and they exhibit the opposite behavior. They have less trouble giving up their personal pass for the individual, but they have more of a problem repurposing that parking lot so that everyone has to give up their parking for the sake of a tennis tournament. So some cultural influences on how willing people are to engage in altruism. And we see that result here. So this graph indicates this very idea that European Americans were more irritated by the individual request, whereas Latin and Asian Americans were more irritated by the more publicly impactful request. Okay, now we're going to switch gears a little bit and look at sexual selectivity, attraction, relationships. And there are a number of influences when it comes to sexual behavior, and one of these big differences is biological, and that is the sex of the individual. So women tend to be more selective than men when it comes to sexual partners. And again, the reason for that goes back to biology. Women, if they become pregnant, now have a 9-month window where they cannot select a new sexual partner, or at least can't produce offspring with that individual. And they are, by definition, more invested in terms of resources in the offspring. So it behooves them to make a good mate choice. Whereas men, if they are not caring for the offspring, their investment in terms of time and resources is relatively small. They also produce far more germ cells, that is, sperm, than women do eggs. And so that becomes a valuable resource more for women than for men. So there's some biological influences on sexual selectivity. There are also, of course, influences of experience and culture. So culturally, many cultures, they have a negative response to females that are less sexually selective than if males exhibit the same behavior. So there's a cultural bias in terms of reputation effects, for example. Uh, there is also a function of experience in terms of whether someone will view another individual as an appropriate mate. So here, for example, on the right, is a diagram from a study showing that when individuals behave cooperatively, they are viewed as being more attractive and presumably as a more appropriate mate choice. So there's another possible hidden benefit of cooperative or altruistic behavior. If it increases your likelihood of reproducing. So these are attractiveness ratings. So people seem more attractive if they've behaved cooperatively. So there's an experiential component there. When it comes to attraction, there is what's called the mere exposure effect. And so what the mere exposure effect says is that just by seeing a stimulus over and over again, it becomes more appealing to you. You start to have more positive response to it. And here, of course, we're talking about people. So the more often you see a person, the more you tend to like them. But it works for actually anything, any sort of stimulus, whether it's art or music or a new food. Uh, so the idea there is that if I've experienced this stimulus before, it must be safe or even beneficial. If it's something new, it could be harmful. I don't know. I don't have enough information. And so this is a way that people tend to prefer the familiar. Another aspect of attraction is, of course, arousal. And there's a famous experiment in which male individuals were stopped on a bridge by an attractive female experimenter and then asked to take a survey and then given the opportunity to call that experimenter later. And so what was surprising was that if this interview occurred on a rickety bridge, one that seemed dangerous, the individuals were far more likely to call the experimenter than if it was a stable bridge. And the idea here is that on the rickety bridge, you experience physiological arousal. You're anxious, you're nervous, you may even be afraid because the bridge seems unsafe. And yet, in the context of that interaction, people misinterpret that fast heart rate, for example, for sexual arousal. So that's called the misattribution of arousal. You're in an aroused state because of the environment, but you attribute it to being attracted to the individual. So physiological state has a role to play in attraction. Beauty obviously has a big impact on sexual selection. So things like body shape, symmetry, age, all impact our perception of beauty. So for males, that upside down triangle, wide shoulders, thin waist is viewed as being attractive. For females, it's an hourglass shape, and they've even calculated experimentally what the optimal hourglass shape is for attraction. And of course, this varies by culture as well, in terms of the overall size of the individual, whether height matters, whether weight matters, but the overall shape is pretty consistent. Symmetry is a big one. So people prefer others to have symmetrical faces when considering attractiveness. Age is another factor. So males tend to prefer younger females and immature features. Uh, Females tend to prefer older males. And the idea there is that younger females uh, tend to be more fertile, and older males tend to have more resources. And so there's a disconnect. That is, it's not universally preferred that someone be younger or older. It depends on the sex of the individual, because older or younger age has different consequences depending on your sex. And beauty, in addition to being more likely to attract a mate, has other effects as well. So people that are rated as more attractive or beautiful tend to earn more, for example, over their lifetime. They tend to have more friends. They tend to engage in more sexual behavior. Even more attractive infants will get more interaction with the parent if they are attractive. So beauty has a number of effects on the lives of the individuals. Similarity has a big effect also. People tend to be attracted and enter relationships with other people that are similar to them. And this similarity could be physical. People tend to marry or enter relationships with other people that are about as attractive as they are. But also, cultural similarity matters. things like sharing a common religion or common background. And there are a number of reasons we think for this, that it's easier to interact with people that are similar, that you're more likely to be able to stay in a long-term relationship. But the fact is that more similar individuals uh, tend to be attracted to one another. And that brings us to relationships. So the question is, why do humans have long-term relationships? Uh, Not all animals do that. Many animals will mate and then will part ways and never see each other again. So the critical factor here is that human offspring are pretty helpless. So babies can't really do much. They can't move around, they can't defend themselves, they can't get their own food, and so they require a lot of care. We've already talked in our development unit why babies are so helpless. It's because we're born underdeveloped. But the fact is that we are helpless as babies, and so we need parental investment. And that means both parents caring for young and doing that for a long time. Which brings up the idea of marriage, which exists in many cultures. And in our culture today, we tend to think of love as being the most important component of a marriage, that people won't even consider entering a marriage if they don't feel love for the other person and believe that the other person loves them back. That is a relatively recent innovation. And researchers have pointed out two kinds of love that kind of exchange roles, exchange importance as a relationship matures. At first, you have passionate love, which is marked by high arousal, lots of interest in sex and sexual activity. And then there is companionate love, which is marked more by affection and concern for the well-being of the other person. And at first, not surprisingly, uh, passionate love is dominant. But as time goes on, companionate love becomes a bigger factor in the relationship. And so there are historical trends with regard to marriage. So not so long ago, marriage was extremely common. Now, if you go way back to the medieval era, it's actually not as common then. But we're talking about the last couple of centuries. Marriage is extremely common. It has become less so over the last couple of decades. So that is a historical trend away from marriage. Uh, and of course, some marriages end in divorce. So there's historical trends there as well. So here we have a graph of trends in marriage on top and divorce at the bottom for the last 100 or so years. And we see that marriage, at least in the last 30 years, has been on the decline, and not surprisingly, so has divorce. So part of the reason that divorce is on the decline is that marriage is also on the decline. So since you have to be married first to get divorced, it's not surprising that if marriage rates go down, so do divorce rates. There are other factors as well, cultural factors, economic factors, but historically, a divorce tends to correlate with marriage. Now, as I just mentioned, relationships change over time. And so the role of comparison is important to consider here. And what I mean by this is the theory is that an individual compares their current state and their current relationship with what they could have. Now, if they're in a great relationship, then odds are that comparison comes out pretty well. If they're in not so great a relationship, they could still stay in it because relative to being single or relative to the pool of people available, being married or in a relationship with the current person may still seem the best option. And when it comes to comparisons, people tend to prefer when their partner is basically in the same situation they are with regard to comparison. If one of them could do much better, that tends to make both people unhappy. And so the comparison of one's circumstances to one's potential circumstances is important when considering marriage rates and divorce rates, whether people stay in a relationship. Okay, that will do it for this lecture. Next time, we're going to look at group influence, so how other people affect our beliefs and our behavior. So we'll look at the need for approval, and how this can lead to some negative outcomes like conformity, like obedience to an authority figure, especially when the group or the authority figure isn't making good or ethical decisions. We'll also look at how we use other people's behavior to reinforce or to form our own beliefs about the world, about what we should do, what are cultural norms, what's the right thing to do, what's ethical. So we'll look at that as well. We'll also look at the psychology of understanding others. So when we have other people are very complex. And so, especially in a complex society where we have perhaps a lot of strangers that we have to deal with, understanding other people and their current state in terms of emotions, their state in terms of information, how they'll respond to us. These are very important functions. And so we'll talk about that next time, and I will see you then.